Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome and introduce everyone to Isaac Chandler, the National Council Chair of Pax Christi USA. Isaac, it's all yours.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Isaac Chandler, and I serve as the chairperson for Pax Christi's USA National Council. I would like to formally welcome all of you to this year's 2021 National Conference. Now, when I say formally, ladies and gentlemen, I only speak to just my introduction is formal. I am dressed up here, but it's totally by accident, so please don't be alarmed. We're sort of an informal group here. Let me start by saying that we are thrilled by the response to this conference. As many of you are aware, we didn't anticipate having nearly 600 people registered to join us throughout the weekend. This is an extraordinary level of engagement, and it speaks to the vitality and strength of our community as we seek to be peacemakers and justice seekers in our church and in the world. Now, this is the first time we're doing this virtually, so we're making history here tonight. And like many things that have taken place over this pandemic year, not everything will go according to plan. But we trust that you will be patient with us, the staff who are handling the tech behind the scenes, our speakers and panelists and moderators as we navigate the sometimes precocious nature of technology. This year's conference promises to be a time of reflection and recommitment, challenge and prayer, and we hope that this time we share together will help all of us to deepen our commitment to nonviolence, to revive our spirits for the work ahead, and to propel us forward in the work of justice and peace. Peace with justice. So we're going to pray together with Pax Christi USA Ambassador of Peace, Megan McKenna, inviting us in her breakout session to reflect on this past year and how we can move out of our tombs and broken spirits into resurrection and restoration. With Bishop John Stowe, Pax Christi USA's incredible and prophetic Bishop President, uniting our movement in the liturgy of the Word and gathering us around a common virtual table for the celebration of the Eucharist at our closing Mass tomorrow. With each other, rooting ourselves in opening and closing prayer services, remembering our identity as disciples of Jesus, members of the beloved community, surrounded by a cloud of witnesses. We're going to study together, breakout sessions on nuclear disarmament, our ongoing commitment to anti-racism and racial justice, the root causes of global migration, and the intersection of economic justice, the climate crisis, violence, workers' rights, and more. The Pax Christi Young Adult Caucus already took up the challenge, investigating one of the most challenging issues of our time, policing, on Thursday night, and whether the path forward is reform or abolition. And many of you joined the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative's lead-in event today, looking at the promotion and practice of nonviolence within the Catholic Church and elsewhere. We'll study with speakers, panelists, and presenters with expertise and experience from organizations and movements like Migrant Roots Media, the Sunrise Movement, the Economy of Francesco Movement, the Pax Christi Anti-Racism Team, the Catholic Worker, and more. And finally, we'll act together, getting prepared to join the Catholic Nonviolence Days of Action in September, taking steps toward the abolition of nuclear weapons, accompanying migrants in the US and families searching for their disappeared loved ones, and building on the commitment Pax Christi USA made over 2 decades ago of becoming an anti-racist movement for justice and peace. Look for other opportunities to take action as members and partners from around the nation are invited to post links in the chat box directing us to act on items like the work for a peace tax fund bill, passing the Breathe Act, or getting trained in nonviolence. We'll pray, study, and act because that is who we are, the peace of Christ, Pax Christi. So welcome, everyone, and let us begin with our opening prayer.
Pax Christi USA wishes to acknowledge and honor with gratitude the land and waterways and the indigenous peoples, past and present, who have stewarded Turtle Island, a territory that includes what is currently known as the United States of America. We recognize and uplift the understanding that much of this land continues to be unceded and that many indigenous peoples nations currently lack federal recognition.
Pax Christi USA wishes to acknowledge the despicable actions of the transatlantic slave trade that paved the way for current anti-Black racism. The labor of enslaved African people built the physical structures and generated the wealth still enjoyed by many of this country's institutions and families. We recognize that while many Catholics were abolitionists, still others profited from this shameful practice, and white people continue to benefit from its legacies to this day.
Pax Christi USA wishes to acknowledge and repent for the role of the institution of the Catholic Church in the process of colonization and its complicity in the sins of anti-Black racism, enslavement, and segregation. We commit ourselves to follow the leadership of Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color, including those within the church, and to support them with intention, time, and money in the struggle for collective liberation.
taken from Help Me to Believe in Beginnings, from Garillas of Grace, Prayers for the Battle by Ted Loder. God of history and of our hearts, so much has happened in our world since we last gathered as community. We've known death and birth. We've been brave and scared. We've hurt. We've helped. We've been honest. We've lied. We've destroyed. We've created. We've been with people. We've been lonely. We've been loyal. We've betrayed. We've decided. We've waffled. We've laughed and we've cried. You know our frail hearts and our frayed history. And now another day begins. Oh God, help us to believe in beginnings and in our beginning again, no matter how often we've failed before. Help us to make beginnings, to begin going out of our weary minds into fresh dreams, daring to make our own bold tracks in the land of now, to begin forgiving that we may experience mercy, to begin questioning the unquestionable that we may know truth, to begin disciplining that we may create beauty, to begin sacrificing that we may accomplish justice, to begin risking that we may make peace, to begin loving that we may realize joy. Help us to be beginnings for others, to be singers to the songless, storytellers to the aimless, befrienders of the friendless, to become beginnings of hope for the despairing, of assurance for the doubting, of reconciliation for the divided, to become beginnings of freedom for the oppressed, of comfort for the sorrowing, of friendship for the forgotten, to become beginnings of beauty for the forlorn, of sweetness for the soured, of gentleness for the angry, of wholeness for the broken, of peace for the frightened and violent of the earth. Help us to believe in beginnings, to make beginnings, to be beginnings, so that we may not just grow old, but grow new. Each day of this wild, amazing life you've called us to live, with the passion and peace of Christ Jesus. Amen.
The first movement in recommitting ourselves to the peace of Christ is recognizing how we have failed in the past and still remain complicit in violence. God of justice, we are the ones whom you have called out of empire, the called out ones, the ecclesia, the church. We are called to resist the power of the culture in which we live and witness instead to the redemptive power of Jesus in his life, death, and resurrection. We are called to be the sacrament, the sign of Christ in our world. Today, we recommit our lives to you. We reject the false promises and temptations of empire. We repent of our complicity in empire, and we pledge to walk forever in your way of justice, love, and peace. O God, amen.
And let us pray together from wherever we are. Our Mother, our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For yours is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, now and forever. Let us all say, amen.
And thank you all very much for the beautiful prayer, reminding us of who we are and who we belong to. And now it is my pleasure that we should now come to the high point of our plenary session. And to get us started, it is my deep and true honor to introduce you all to the Roxana Bendezú, Pax Christi USA's program director, who will introduce us to tonight's keynote speaker. Roxana.
Thank you so much, Isaac, for that beautiful, loving introduction. There's a reason why we call this a home or community home, because there are people out there who truly care about you and truly appreciate the work and your full humanity. So we're here for that. We're here to share with others and to learn together and to take action, right? So, I have to say, what a beautiful, beautiful way to start. Just this mixture of prayer in this candid reflections from all of you. I really appreciate y'all and all the work that was poured into this today. So I will introduce myself. My name is Roxana Bendezú. My pronouns are she, her, ella. I'm a descendant of the Quechua people of the Andes of South America, and I greet you from lands that have been and continue to be cared for, shared, and respected by the Innu and Occaneechi communities, as well as the Tuscarora Nation, a territory also known as Durham, North Carolina. I invite you to learn about the indigenous peoples who live and have lived in the territory where you live currently, and we can share this link in the chat down there so you can have a place to go and look for that. I also want to encourage folks who are able to give back the land to do so. And I also like to recognize the people present who have ancestors and family members who have and or are experiencing similar struggles as the indigenous people here in Turtle Island. We see you and we love you. So now, let me, without further ado, introduce this amazing person that we have here today. Olga Marina Segura is a freelance writer, the opinion and culture editor at the National Catholic Reporter, and the author of Birth of a Movement, Black Lives Matter and the Catholic Church. Previously, she was an associate editor at American Media, where she wrote and solicited articles on race and culture. She's a co-founder and former co-host of the podcast Jesuitical. Her writing has appeared in The Guardian, Latino Rebels, Shondaland, Sojourners, Refinery 29, Pitch Media, and The Revealer. So I present to you, Olga Segura.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. And thank you to you, Roxana, for introducing me. And thank you to Johnny and the entire Pax Christi team for inviting me to be the keynote speaker this year. And also thank you to everyone who's tuning in tonight on a Friday evening, no less, to hear me talk about my book and my own journey. It truly means a lot. And before I kind of get into it, I just want to let you guys know I am based in the Bronx and it is a Friday evening. So at any moment throughout my talk, you will hear loud music. You may or may not, but just to warn you that you will hear some noise at some point throughout this evening. I want to just kind of point back to the prayer that we were just led in. It's always really, really important for me to hear prayer that really does not just centers us, but also really challenges us to, as Brian mentioned when he was on doing his prayer, to really resist the false promises of empire. That is something that I have really, really been thinking about this past year, especially after my book. And I'm so excited to be doing this at a time when people are also thinking about these things. And I hope that my work and my own spiritual journey can help Catholics who are trying to think about what it means to be Catholics who reject empire. So at this time last year, I was finishing my very first book, Birth of a Movement, Black Lives Matter and the Catholic Church, as Roxana read earlier. And the book was the culmination of years spent researching, writing, and thinking about this social justice movement born in 2013 following the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the killing of Trayvon Martin. And like many people, I am a part of the millennial generation. Like many people, I first encountered this movement when it was just an online campaign on Twitter and Facebook. And I learned about the work that its founders, Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi, and organizers were doing all across the country. And I began attending marches in New York in 2014. And shortly after I began to step into these organizing spaces, I began writing about the movement and how Black and Brown Catholics were engaging with it or not engaging with it. And these conversations were extremely important in my own work because I was having conversations with other Catholics of color during this time. And these were a lot of Catholics who had been doing anti-racism work for a very long time in the Catholic Church. And these are Catholics who were also actively grappling with how this movement could help us to decenter our churches, to sort of move our church away from its relationship with whiteness and to really engage with the signs of the times. And being able to be in conversations with so many other Black and Brown Catholics who were trying to make sense of this movement at a time in my 20s where I was kind of at a very crucial turning point in my faith life, in my professional life, being able to do this type of reporting and have these conversations really allowed me to begin to develop a lens that I had never gotten in many of the white liberal Catholic spaces that I have inhabited since I arrived in the United States. And the more I read and wrote about this movement, the more I followed Black Catholics who helped me think for the very first time in my life more deeply about Blackness, abolition, sexuality, colorism, capitalism, militarism. These were, of course, very, very important topics, but these were things that I had never been encouraged to think of, again, in the very white Catholic spaces I had been educated in. And thanks to a lot of thinkers, like these are three thinkers who really at this point were crucial for me, thinkers like Zahida Kelly, Zoe Zadmutzi, and William C. Anderson, they helped me to think about these issues and to also think more deeply about what we mean when we talk about American imperialism, or what we mean when we talk about how capitalism helps maintain empire and how white supremacy is ingrained into every American institution, including our church. And being able to do this reporting at a time when I was also using social media to really engage with different thinkers, especially thinkers who were much more left-leaning than I was, this helped me to also think more deeply about my identity, especially as someone who was born in the Dominican Republic and arrived in America in the early 90s. And my family arrived here chasing that ever elusive American dream. And these thinkers helped me to realize that the American dream was just a lie that was fed to people like my family. And what did it mean to kind of unlearn this and to begin to think about what it means to identify as a Black immigrant with light skin? I began to think more deeply about my own privilege. I started to read and understand issues like misogyny and, again, colorism, how these things had shaped my adopted home and the motherland I had left behind. And I developed the framework to really talk about the anti-Blackness and colorism within my own Black Dominican community. And it took me years to unlearn and begin to truly understand my own Black immigrant identity, one that was extremely privileged and also very oppressed. And so these were all of the things that were happening to me throughout my 20s when I was reporting and researching on this movement. And I was learning so much and I was developing this voice as a writer. And so in early 2020, this was the lens that I approached this book with. And despite my engagement with very leftist thinkers, I still went into this book writing with a very specific white Catholic lens, even though I was being encouraged by thinkers who had rejected white supremacy and who had worked to decolonize the way that they thought about what it meant to exist in this country. I was still boxing myself in. And initially, this book was much more concerned with maintaining power than actually questioning it. I originally outlined a book that would center the feelings and comfort of white people. This was going to be a book that would commend Catholics who have demonstrated their commitment to fighting for racial equity. I was going to really praise white Catholics who, for lack of a better word, had done a really good job with performative allyship. And I wanted to make sure that they felt safe. And I wanted to gently challenge white Catholics and white people who remained silent on things like the Black Lives Matter movement, on things like police brutality, anti-Blackness, white supremacy within the church. And I wanted to do this as part of the anti-racist lens that had made its way into my writing, but still centering the comfort of white people in everything that I was doing. I didn't want to upset anyone. And so I wrote the early drafts and outlines of this book, really carrying this fear that I couldn't upset white people and I couldn't make white people uncomfortable because I work in this Catholic space and it is a very small Catholic media space, and I didn't want to burn any bridges and I didn't want to have the quote unquote wrong tone in this work. And then 2020 completely changed that for me and changed it for a lot of people in my generation. And this is going to sound repetitive to a lot of people who have already engaged with my book and engaged with my work, but I think this is something that bears repeating every time I do this, especially with predominantly white audiences. 2020 really impacted me in a way that I was not expecting. And I think this is a case for many people on this call, because I had spent months and years learning about how systemic oppression occurred. I was learning about how systemic oppression worked in our church and Catholic spaces. I was learning about the ways that media had internalized white supremacy. But in 2020, I really, really saw firsthand just how violent the empire is, for lack of a better word. I really, really internalized for the first time that, oh, our country, our government is committed to maintaining its power, maintaining its might, maintaining its empire, no matter who we lose in the process. And so this was happening because there were so many tragedies happening all around me. Black women and men were being killed by the police. Black mothers were dying in hospitals at 3 times the rate of white women. Black transgender women and men were murdered. 2020 was the most violent year for this community. We saw how children were being separated from parents and caged at the border. In prison, women and men remained incarcerated amid social distancing. And we saw thousands of Americans were dead, a number that has since grown to over 600,000 during a global pandemic. And at this time, I was trying to record every tragedy that was happening in the country, around the world, in the Catholic world, while also just trying to survive. I was trying to write the perfect book. I was trying to strike the perfect balance. I was trying to get the perfect thoughts and make sure that everything on paper was, again, centering the comfort of white people and prioritizing the fact that, oh, you know, when we talk about welcoming white people into these spaces, we have to really do it in a way that feels safe for them, do it in a way that really doesn't push them away from doing this work. But while I was trying to process this, while my family and friends were working as essential workers in a pandemic that killed 20, 30,000 New Yorkers by August of last year, while I saw my parents, instead of getting ready to retire, continuing to have to work as low essential workers, seeing all the educators in my life have to really work in education in a way that they never had before, I realized that so many people of color, we were just trying to survive. The number one thing for us was just trying to survive and trying to survive all the different violent things that were being thrown in our way. And amid that darkness, that realization that being in a constant survival mode, being in a constant moment where you are afraid for your loved ones, afraid for marginalized communities all across the country and all across the world, that really pushed me into a really, really dark place. And amid that darkness, it was a very, very real borderline nihilistic place that I found myself in. And it took me months to spiritually sort of get myself out of that. But it was in that darkness, in that very dark space, that I realized I have to survive. And for me to survive and for me to continue doing the work that God really has encouraged me to do, I had to let go of the need to constantly center that white Catholic gaze. And that was the first time that I had really, really internalized that. It was the first time that I thought to myself, oh, okay, you can't care about centering marginalized and oppressed communities while also only being mindful of white fragility. And all of this was happening. I'm sort of describing this in a more fleshed out way, but all of this was happening very, very quickly at a time when I was writing my book and also editing my book. So there was this trend, this sort of tension that existed in my writing, because I was trying to reconcile the fact that I had started this project with one thing in mind, and then it became this completely different thing because I was radicalized politically and spiritually, however we want to call it, in a way that I had never expected. And I cared about survival, and caring about survival and caring about my community surviving, my loved ones surviving, really meant learning about how and why our survival is threatened every single day in this country and all around the world. And so again, that was a very dark space that I found myself in. That was a space that, in hindsight, was very, very anxious and was very, to borrow sort of the Jesuit lingo that I was grateful to internalize while I was at America. 2020, for most of the year, was a huge place of desolation for me. And it was difficult to know that you still had to create something. You still had to create a product that could help people understand everything that was happening. And so I thought to myself, okay, you're going to do this work. You're going to keep writing. Your writer voice has changed, but it can't just be this very liberal Catholic stance that I had at the start of it. And it really, all of this evolution that was happening in 2020 really forced me to begin to think more deeply about not just white supremacy or systemic oppression, or police brutality or anti-Blackness. These are all things that are still crucial to my work and I will continue talking about. But I was forced to think about these things on a much more granular level in a way that I never really had before. And I began to actively think about, what do we mean when we say imperialism? What do we mean when we talk about capitalism? What do we mean when we say these systems sustain each other? And I want to just preface the next part of this with saying that I'm still a student. I am still someone who is learning these things and grappling with these things in real time. And I think that's okay. I think that's a part of the journey. I think that's a part of a learning experience. And I think that's part of what the community we're supposed to be doing together. And 2020 really pushed me to understand how imperialism is a system that, under capitalism, pushes states and governments worldwide into constant competition with one another. And under our current economic system, this competitive process means that imperialist nations like England and the United States only care about having the strongest military, economy, or workforce. And every day, states and governments all around the world work to ensure that they control the most people, the most lands, the most resources. The only goal under imperialism is empire. Imperialism and capitalism prioritize and promote profit over people. These systems view workers as disposable, and they create the violent inequities we see worldwide. From housing and healthcare disparities in the United States, to police brutality in Brazil, to settler colonialist violence in Palestine. I began to think about how US imperialism in particular is maintained worldwide, and how the United States uses its government, its immensely huge, the immensely huge budgets that they allocate to the military, how it uses this to not just maintain its power abroad, but also to oppress people worldwide. And under these systems, under the systems of imperialism, capitalism, we are not surviving. Marginalized groups cannot survive under these systems, right? Because these systems need someone to be exploited so that a very small group of people can succeed and become really rich and powerful. And once I internalized that, once I fully for lack of a better word, felt a veil being lifted from me, my work, my voice became much more urgent and became much more militant, because it became concerned with liberation and with dismantling systems that don't want my people to be free. And so the book became more urgent, the book became more militant. And again, I like to use that word because I think it really did become more militant in a way that I didn't expect. But in turn, all of this evolution, all of these different changes that were happening in my life, all of the ways that my writer voice was evolving and my politics were evolving and my understanding of this country, all of this had a profound effect on my obviously my political life, but also my spiritual life as well, because it's really easy to sit here in front of you guys and say, you know, like, I understand what imperialism means. I understand what capitalism means. I'm trying to see how it plays out in our academic spaces, in our media spaces, in our healthcare system. But it's not an easy thing to internalize. Again, for me, having this understanding and accepting this was also met with, again, I keep returning to sort of nihilism, because I think that's what I keep sort of returning to when I think about myself in 2020. And my spiritual life was really suffering, because I thought, okay, I am seeing firsthand how empire works in this country. I'm seeing firsthand how our country's internalizing of profit over people has devastated my communities, how it has killed my communities. And seeing this also happen at a time when our institutional church is still very polarized, at a time when the American Catholic Church is fighting. There's a lot of infighting with our bishops. There's a lot of infighting with Catholics on the left, Catholics on the right. And this realization coming to me at a time after I wrote my first book and realizing that I'm still a student and there's still so much that I have to learn, and feeling as if there's sort of no pastoral leadership from our church's hierarchy was really, really scary for me, because I thought, oh, okay, now I have this new understanding, but what does it mean to actually apply that to your work, right? What does it mean to reconcile that with our Catholicism? What does it mean to actually go to the margins with this new knowledge that I was learning? So I began publicly grappling with what it means to decenter colonialism and whiteness in both the private and public Catholic spaces I was a part of. I began to analyze how I was taught to think about spirituality, theology, worship, prayer, communion in the white Catholic spaces that had educated me and that I was working in. And I began to decolonize my Catholicism, trying to remove it from the white supremacist colonialism internalized throughout many of our institutions and churches. And I did this because I thought, okay, my faith life is struggling, my prayer life is struggling, I don't feel grounded, and I'm still very much in this place of desolation. But at least let me use my writing and my thinking post-book to kind of grapple with a lot of these things and to begin to think, okay, if the current systems are not going to save us, if the current systems don't necessarily align with my understanding of the gospel, then what are systems that do align with how I imagine Jesus would want us to be in the 21st century? And I began publicly grappling with socialism and what it meant to create a classless society, one where workers can control and own what they produce, a society that was free of exploitation and oppression. Excuse me. I began to think about Catholic social teaching and how it relates to socialism and how it could help guide Catholics who were trying to build an anti-capitalist lens in all of the work that they were doing. And I began to wonder, how can I and other Catholics like me who were undergoing the same type of spiritual, political evolution and awakening, whatever word we want to use, how can we as Catholics use this knowledge to begin to build community power? And how could this knowledge challenge Catholics and all Christians to really actively and consistently work to change the very real material conditions that we were seeing of oppressed peoples here and abroad? And what did it mean to think about these things? What did it mean to be conscientized in this way, in such a quick way? And what did this require of us? And I'm still grappling with many of these questions because I don't think that there are easy answers to any of this. But one of the most crucial things for my own evolution and my own thinking was Pope Francis's encyclical Fratelli Tutti, which was released in October of last year. And this encyclical, I really, really just love this encyclical. And I'm just a fan of Pope Francis's writing in general, because I think it really gives people like me the opportunity to think about theology and to think about philosophy in a way that is not intimidating. I like that he really emphasizes and encourages us to say, hey, we should all be able to talk about Christianity. We should all be able to talk about the gospel, and we should all be able to talk about what it means to build a Christian community in ways that are more inviting. And so at the center of this document is Pope Francis's focus on the parable of the Good Samaritan. And in this parable, the Samaritan is the only person who stops to help an injured man. He is the only one who stops and shows mercy for the person who is suffering in front of him, a man who was not from the same world or experience as him. In this encyclical, Pope Francis uses this parable to really urge Catholics to work toward a culture that authentically treats every human being, regardless of their social class or race, with the respect and dignity that we see the Samaritan show the injured man. He calls on us to fight against any person or system that teaches us to be individualistic, greedy. He calls on us to fight against systems that force us to reject the common good and systems that choose money over people. Excuse me, just need to take a quick little sip. And Fratelli Tutti really encourages us to think about how we as Catholics, especially ones who are thinking about what it means to consider systems outside of capitalism and how they relate to Catholic social teaching. This document really encourages us to, again, reject the comforts, privileges, and lies that capitalism, imperialism, that the empire really sells us. We must work toward a world where no one is suffering, a world where every single human being is safe, free, and a world where every human being has what they need to survive. And instead of centering our own wants, well-being, and needs above those of the community, we have to reject the systems that created the throwaway society we're in. We have to create a culture built around a love that transcends the barriers of geography and distance. And this document, at a time when my spiritual life, again, was almost non-existent, this document really gave me a blueprint to think about the ways that Catholicism was to play a role in my thinking, and the ways that Catholicism could help me, for lack of a better word, feel more hopeful about the changes that I had undergone, the political and spiritual awakening that I had undergone. This document really helped me to feel like I had some answers to what I was looking for. And so the more time I spent with this document, the more I read it, the more I began to really internalize and challenge myself to think about what Pope Francis was calling us to do. And you're going to have to bear with me a bit because I'm going to pull a lot from this document because I think it ties into what it means to do the work to do real liberatory work in our church at this time. In this document, Pope Francis calls on us to develop a fraternal openness that allows us to acknowledge, appreciate, and love each other. He calls on us to work toward peace and walk with the poor, the abandoned, the infirm, and the outcast, the least of his brothers and sisters, and create a community that supports and helps us, in which we can help one another to keep looking ahead. He calls out what he describes as ancient conflicts thought long buried, breaking out anew, in instances of a myopic, extremist, resentful, and aggressive nationalism. He critiqued a system that strengthens the identity of the more powerful, that protects themselves, the rich, the powerful, while also undermining the identity of the weaker and poorer regions, making them more vulnerable and dependent. Fratelli Tutti really challenges us as Catholics to push back against oppressive systems and reimagine what it means to be a Christian community. This document urges us to focus on what it means to be in solidarity with oppressed groups, what it means to have a shared vision of the common good, and what it means to be people who identify with the vulnerability of others, people who reject the creation of a society of exclusion, and people who act instead as neighbors, who lift up and rehabilitate the fallen for the sake of the common good. In this document, Francis also challenges us to develop a more historical and critical lens and understand how capitalism and imperialism how these systems have created social inequality, how white supremacist and racist ideologies support these systems, and how these systems condition us to commodify each other and view one another as competitors rather than as a community. And many Catholics, including myself, have struggled with understanding just how systemic racism and oppression truly are. This is because racism is never adequately taught or defined in our educational spaces. We're not taught history correctly. For example, we're taught Pilgrims versus colonizers. We're taught about the birth of America versus the destruction of Turtle Island. We aren't encouraged to sit with church history and learn how the church has been complicit in the sin of slavery, what its racial justice efforts have been throughout the American church's history, and how it's failed in these efforts. I first learned about the church's complicity in chattel slavery thanks to the scholarship of Shannon D. Williams. I learned that our church was instrumental to the industry's introduction to what became the United States in the 1500s. And as Williams wrote last year, after chattel slavery was abolished, many Catholic religious orders of men and women and seminaries continued to systematically exclude African-descended people, especially US-born Black people, from admission on the basis of race well into the 20th century. Williams added that archival oral history and written record is also littered with heart-wrenching examples of white Catholics subjecting Black and brown Catholics to humiliating segregation and exclusion in white-lit parishes, schools, hospitals, convents, seminaries, and neighborhoods. We are taught to understand individual racism, but not systemic racism, which includes practices, policies that have become deeply embedded in various institutions. And these practices and policies, in turn, have led to the exclusion of people of color from church leadership, politics, academia, Hollywood, and media. Additionally, we are educated to believe that consumerism, capital, individualism are the keys to our success and happiness, and that the rich and powerful have honestly and safely acquired their power and resources, that they are more deserving than the rest of the world. Yet in reality, the world economy has created an unrelenting process of competition and conflict between the world's capitalist classes of different states, states who are vying for domination and exploitation of the globe's people, wealth, and resources. The rich and powerful must be concerned with profit over people in our current system, and so rejecting capitalism imperialism means embracing and creating a culture that actively and consistently centers those who are most exploited under capitalism. And Fratelli Tutti really challenges us to imagine a world free from such exploitation, free from such consumerism, from a culture that again centers profit over people. So what does it mean for Catholics to take the challenges of this document seriously? If we are called to be anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, and we are to use whatever resources we can allocate to ease the suffering of others, to better center marginalized groups in the United States and worldwide, what does this look like practically? For me, and I want to include sort of my own how this document has challenged me, in particular this year. For me, it's really been a call to action to finally learn and center the Palestinian cause and to stand in solidarity with our Arab and Muslim brothers and sisters who are fighting for liberation here from here in New York City all the way to Gaza. And this also part of stepping into a space that I have never been in before. It means admitting that for much of my work, I have chosen to think about liberation almost exclusively through very, very Western eyes, And I've thought about liberation centering my own experience, which is also important to this work, but mostly centering very American experiences and the experience of other Black Americans and over the plight of Black and Brown people in oppressed lands all around the world. So for me, internalizing this document and thinking about creating what Pope Francis calls us to do in this document, to create a community not where we negate our differences, but where we understand that we are all different but still together. For me, this means prioritizing experiences unlike my own and unlike those prioritized in Catholic spaces, especially in the media spaces I occupy. In recent months, I've started to educate myself about Palestinian history and struggles for independence. I am reading books like Palestine, A Socialist Introduction by Sumaya Awad and Brian Bean. I am learning from the resources provided by thinkers like Assad Dandia, whose writing and work helps Catholics to think more deeply about interfaith work between Catholics and Muslim, and encourages readers of all traditions or no faith traditions to read and learn from Islamic thinkers like Hamid Dabashi, Kessia Ali, and Ismail M. Montana. I'm also attending rallies and learning from organizers in the United States who have for years organized around the Palestinian cause. I'm also admitting how little I know and allowing myself to learn from others, internalizing that, as Pope Francis calls on us, as Pope Francis reminds us, no one is saved alone. We can only be saved together. And I wanted to start my talk today with my own evolution and my story as a writer and as a Catholic from the last year in particular, with focusing in particular on my new commitment to really grapple with what it means for Catholics to think about the Palestinian cause and to think about being in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle for liberation, because I get a lot of white Catholics who tell me that they can't do this work because they don't know how, you know, or I get white Catholics who say, I don't understand these issues. I don't understand whatever theory or framework organizers or thinkers of color are calling for. I don't know how to go to the margins at a time of social distancing. And it's okay to feel these things. It's okay to have questions, especially at a time when we are still in a pandemic and there are still very real fears about being out in public spaces together. But these cannot be excuses. Our faith calls us to step outside of where we are comfortable and step into the unknown. And it's not easy for me, especially after writing a book, to admit that I'm a student and I still have so much to learn from people who have been doing this work much longer than I have, for people who have been thinking about the Palestinian cause for much longer than I have. But it is okay to humbly acknowledge that and to say, hey, I want to learn. I want to learn from others how to do liberatory work. It's okay to say that. It's okay to say that I'm still being led, that I'm still being taught by so many people around me. My faith is still being challenged, and every single day I'm learning, especially from non-Catholics, what it means to really live out the gospel. Every day I'm learning what it means to internalize that anti-racism work means being concerned with anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist work as well. White Catholics, white people, must not run away from the discomfort many of you have clung to for so long. White people in our church and country don't want to relinquish or even talk about in many cases about the power that white people, white Catholics hold in this country. If you want to be an ally and you want to build a world where people from marginalized groups can feel safe, you must actively and consistently reject your white privilege, while also understanding how white supremacy, capitalism, imperialism have been systems that have benefited many white people while also simultaneously exploiting and killing marginalized groups. We have seen this in the past year alone. More than 600,000 Americans have died during a pandemic that has made many white men, women, and institutions richer. No one wants to sit with the reality that if you as a white person care about solidarity, if you truly care about Black lives, about creating a more inclusive church and nation, then you have to ask yourself, what am I willing to give up to truly center and uplift marginalized groups? In 2020, we saw white Catholics engaging with the Black Lives Matter movement and other social justice organizations, and many were actively and consistently raising funds for organizers and using their various platforms to urge fellow white Catholics to support people of color being disproportionately affected by COVID-19. Many hosted Zoom book clubs and webinars where they discussed many of the topics I've mentioned here tonight. Many listened and learned from women and men of color. And all of these efforts are important and they must continue. But they are not enough, and white Catholics, both lay and clergy, must not get complacent. Primarily white Catholic institutions, from hospitals to academic institutions to media, must create positions in their respective fields for people of color. As Pope Francis calls us to do in Fratelli Tutti, we must continue to develop our historical lens and understand that American imperialism benefits from and actively participates in the hyper-surveillance of and violence against marginalized groups, including Black activists and Muslim communities. We must actively and consistently reject empire. Catholic institutions must reject funding from wealthy, racist, xenophobic, and Islamophobic donors. Catholic high schools, universities, and publications must de-center whiteness and actively center Catholics of color, as well as other non-white, non-Catholic voices. We must build a church that actively centers experiences different from our own. In my own life, this means reading, learning from, and centering Muslim experts, including Nuruddin Kizwani, the founder of the organization within our lifetime, United for Palestine. Catholic spaces, from our media to our schools to our parishes, can be resources that help Catholics more fully reflect on and understand the role of US imperialism, especially how it impacts Black and Brown people, from here all the way to the Middle East. In particular, how Christians perpetuate Islamophobia. We must work to create a world rebuilt by men and women who identify with the vulnerability of others. We must reject the creation of a society of exclusion, and we must act as neighbors toward one another. We must lift up and rehabilitate the fallen for the sake of the common good. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Olga. This was such an amazing presentation. I honestly, what I want to do is just ask everyone to unmute themselves and just give you a big round of applause. You have taken, but no, Johnny's going to. We have a whole lot of people here in this room. But you know what? I'm just so in awe of the fact that you are just bringing so much vulnerability to this space. And I just really want to honor that, first of all, because as a woman of color, as a racialized woman in this country, I understand that is very difficult to do. And I really want to honor that and really, let you know that I see you, and it's quite a lot. It's quite a lot. But I know that you've talked about so many different issues today, and every single one of them is important. We have only a short time, maybe 45 minutes. And I know people are going to want to make a whole lot of questions. We already have questions from the audience, and I want to make sure that we try to get to them. One thing that I really wanted to bring up was the quote that you mentioned from Pope Francis on Fratelli Tutti, and I believe I actually pulled it up. It's Fratelli Tutti 137, and it's, we need to develop the awareness that nowadays we are either all saved together or no one is saved. And I always like to use the hashtag all of us or none,
Mhm.
because I really think that that's the approach, right? And I really think that that's the reason why we bring all this energy and all this work into these spaces, right? To try to get the knowledge that was forbidden, honestly, or invisibilized.
Mhm.
And a lot of people, and I would say the majority of people, don't really know it, don't really understand it, never had a chance to learn it.
Mhm.
And here we are in a space with 200 plus people and more on Facebook Live, trying to hear your voice, trying to hear what you bring. And so this is a really huge moment that we're navigating. I really want us to really get grounded on that.
Mhm.
Because it's historical. And I know it seems like, oh, well, it's a Friday evening and I'm just connected to Zoom. Well, that is how history happens, right? This is how people become aware. This is how people get grounded. This is how people get the energy that they need to do more, to take that other step of action. And I know I saw some calls to action in the chat already from people who are working at the grassroots level in many different issues. And of course, we will keep sharing those with the audience. One of the things that I wanted to mention is the vulnerability that you bring. It also includes talking about your own family members and the struggle that you went through, with your dad, and when he became ill of COVID, and how you started really noticing, this really obvious lack of attention, for lack of a better word, for communities of color, for racialized community, right? And so what would you like to share about that? I feel like that's a very important moment in a moment that really make you really consider what you needed to do and the voice that you needed to use. And so, like, what was that, a motor, a drive that pushed you to go ahead and say, you know what, I just have to say it?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for everything you just said, Roxana, too, because I always love doing these events with other women of color in particular, because I also feel like we understand the spaces that we occupy, and it's so important, like you said, to kind of be in community with one another and acknowledge this. And that, like you said, like you described it in your phrasing too, was a pivotal moment in my, not just my spiritual life and my writing life, whatever you want to call it. It was just one of the most difficult moments for me to deal with in my life in general, because my father became sick and my partner's father became sick. And this was very early on in the pandemic too, right? Where we didn't understand all of the things that we knew now. And having to be confronted with the fact that not just are my parents getting older, but my parents are also working within a system that is going to continue to exploit them and work them until it can no longer do that, because the system profits off of people working to produce for the people at the top. And to see the way that even when your loved ones are sick, even when your loved ones are dying, the machine of capitalism is still going to keep on profiting. To know that you could be terrified of losing a loved one, that you could have lost a loved one, and to try to grapple with death or the possibility of death at a time when you don't have your community, right? Because we're also really, really social distance, and we were dealing with this in very specific, in isolation, for lack of a better word. To know that I was dealing with all of this, and that I was still sort of creating this book and still operating within the capitalist system myself, because I also have to survive, right? My material conditions require me to also engage in this system, and to know that the system will just exploit you no matter who you are, no matter what you do. You could do all of the right things and the system could still say, hey, actually, I'm not going to provide the medical resources that you need. I'm not going to provide testing. I'm not going to be able to provide masks. So we're not going to be able to have the resources and the things that we need. that was really, really devastating for me to have to deal with. And I'm still very privileged because my father survived this, and my father, unlike many people, there are many people who were not as fortunate and who had to actually grapple with losing a loved one. But to know that this system that you have spent your whole life, not my whole life, but my whole professional life writing about and understanding, and knowing that, oh my God, it's even worse than I expected. It's even worse than I thought. And all of the things that these leftist thinkers had made me think of, when I engaged with a lot of these leftist thinkers in my mid to late 20s, I thought, oh, okay, maybe things aren't that bad, right? Maybe it's just like the spaces they occupy. And then 2020 came around and I was like, oh, no. Imperialism has one goal in mind, and it's to create profit for states, governments, individual people around the world to become more powerful. It's not concerned with the common good, right? And what does it mean to know that you have to continue to operate in the system? Because again, material conditions have not changed. And what does it mean to try to figure out how to still do good work? And these are still questions that I'm struggling with till this day, right? I think we're still trying to grieve and understand how the pandemic has really changed a lot of us. But having that happened with my loved ones, that was how, again, to borrow Pope Francis's language, right? He tells us that it's through encounters, through very real experiences, that we are radicalized. And that was a moment where I was radicalized and pushed into leftist ideology that I had not expected, right? I became more concerned with, oh, okay, I need to care about the least among us. I need to care about people who actually have even less than I do and still have to try to make it work. And I have to think about what it means to every day try to create a better world, and that's not easy. It's not easy to do that work, and it's devastating. And I think it's spiritually devastating in a lot of ways. But I think, like you mentioned, Roxana, this is how history happens too, right? The fact that I am here today talking to people who care about these things, that is a part of the work that's being done. And to be able to be in community with you all today is the hopeful reminder that, like, yes, there's a lot of darkness that's happening, but there's also a lot of light that we have to look for. And I think that's another thing that happened to me in the past year. Like, I became much more willing to see where the spirit is moving in everyday sort of grassroots ways, in a way that I wasn't before. I think it was easier for me to kind of just be cynical. And I think 2020, for most of it, and even at the start of this year, it's easy for me to kind of gravitate toward being cynical and gravitate toward being negative. But again, being in spaces like this, and even seeing the Pax Christi, like the statement of principles that you guys shared with me earlier this week, I was like, wait a minute, there are people who are like, no, we're gonna stand with Palestine. We're going to stand with our LGBTQ brothers and sisters, and we're going to do this work. And that's also courageous for me too. I think being invited into the spaces that I've been invited into is helping me grapple with all the very real devastations of 2020.
Thank you. And I know a lot of people are probably freaking out right now, and they're thinking, oh my gosh, all these big words that she's using, all these concepts that she's bringing into this space, what is going on here? What have we become? And let me assure folks that it's okay. We will study this together, and we will dissect all these concepts together, and you will feel much more comfortable with all these definitions in the near future, if not already, for many. And I know many actually are probably pretty comfortable with this. And I know because one of the questions is very specific, and it says, what does it mean for Catholics to reject capitalism and imperialism in a country led by Joe Biden, an imperialist and self-proclaimed capitalist who claims a very public Catholicism?
Yeah, that is, whoever asked that question, thank you. That is a very, very real question, especially at a time when Joe Biden is being hailed as like this Catholic savior, while also still very much embodying a lot of the neoliberal policies that feed empire and that feed imperialism. So I think how I like to think about it, and this is, I'm sharing with you guys sort of how I'm thinking about these things on a daily sort of more individual everyday level. I think, like I said, it is very real. Until our material conditions change, we all have to operate in the system. And so I think some of the concrete ways that I'm thinking about what it means to be more imperialist, especially as a Catholic, one, I'm thinking about sustainability, right? I'm thinking about how Pope Francis is often talking about, especially in the encyclical, what it means to be a part of a consumerist culture that it cares more about individualism and that cares more about what we can achieve. So for me, I'm thinking, okay, if you are going to write a book, if you are freelancing and you are making a certain amount of money, how can you take part of what you're making and contribute to other people? How can you contribute to organizations that are helping us think more deeply about how to care for the environment or how to fight for climate change? So I think about that. I think about the own practices in my life. I try to not just be less of a consumerist myself. I'm trying to think about what it means to divest from systems that are destroying the planet, what it means to divest from institutions that are exploiting the Palestinian people on occupied land, right? I think there's a lot of learning that has to be done and learning where everything that you get comes from, right? And choosing, instead of buying something on Amazon, right? How can I buy something from a local organization that I can support? And also another way that I'm thinking about this is also talking to people about this, right? Because again, I think people think that you need to have the answers to this, right? And these are things that I'm engaging with for the very first time, right? I'm still trying to figure out, okay, well, if I can't opt out of capitalism because I still need healthcare, I still have to pay for food, I still have to pay for my rent, how can I do that? How can I learn how to do that in other ways? How can I learn how to do that through my writing? How can I learn to do that by centering voices who are helping Catholics to think about these things? And again, I am joining organizations and people who are helping me think about these things. I'm joining with other Catholics in New York who are thinking about these things and who are doing this work. One of the things that I've been thinking about in 2021, and I'm grateful for my organizer friends in the Bronx who are doing this, is thinking about the green spaces in New York. We talked about, when the event started tonight, we talked about land acknowledgement, right? And what does it mean to reclaim our own green spaces? What does it mean to have lands in the Bronx that don't have any food on them, that don't have any sort of viable options for us to kind of opt out of the food empire? So I engage with organizers who are doing a lot of work like that and who are educating people on how to reclaim the lands where they're from. So again, I'm still actively thinking about a lot of these things, and I'm just learning from people around me who are helping me think about what it means to dismantle an empire while still needing to survive in this very real empire. So I know that's not an exact answer, but I also want to be very real with everyone tuning in today that I don't have all of these answers figured out, but it doesn't mean that we can't talk about it, right? I think it's okay to also acknowledge that, yes, I'm engaging with this, but I'm also learning from other people as well.
And, you know, I think that's why your book is so interesting, because you not only talk about the concepts, about, you know, the historical facts, of course, and whatnot, but you also talk about that struggle, right? Like that journey, that, yeah, like the journey that you're going through, and really being so honest and saying, you know, I didn't know a lot of this. And then I bumped into, you know, so-and-so, and then I learned about this and that. And you make it sound, that's why I think the book is so accessible, because you make it sound like something that people can also do, right? Can also engage in this journey of learning, this journey of accompanying, of listening, and then of course studying and praying and really be grounded in community and taking action, right? Because that it's also a component that is so necessary. And I think just want to remind of our three pillars in Pax Christi USA, of course, pray, study, and action. And so that is so so different, right? It's not an academic book that is inaccessible, that people are just like, oh no, I have to read like, you know, 50 pages for the next meeting. No, like people were really looking forward to reading together, to talking in their groups. They wanted more time, actually. That's what the feedback that I got is like, we want more time to talk about it. So the last meeting actually was just, you know, a lot of breakouts for folks to have the chance to talk a little more. And so, but I also wanted to talk about Pope Francis in the push very openly, actually, against capitalism. And the fact that, you know, of course, the words don't need to match exactly, right? But it's right, it's there, it's obvious, it's right there. And what is interesting is that he doesn't leave it at, oh, you know, you need to recycle and you need to like do this and that, which is like great if we can do it, obviously. I also believe that some people who are not able to do it because of whatever reason, I won't judge them. Right. Honestly, because that is really not what is going to ultimately change the world, you know, or keep this or Mother Earth with us, but it will be the larger actions, right? The actions that we're able to do together in community, right? But we have to start I think embodying our beliefs if we are able to do so as much as we can, right? And I think Pope Francis really talks about that, but also talks about the larger picture and really just calls them out. And I know that, you know, there are a lot of things that definitely he doesn't do or doesn't do well or doesn't do at all, but there are some things that he does, and I think this is one of them. People used to say, oh, it's just about unfettered capitalism, and I think we're moving now towards like, no, this is about just capitalism, period.
Right. No, I totally agree with you, and I think that you're right. He doesn't necessarily use the words empire or like reject imperialism or reject capitalism, but he does demonstrate an understanding of how we have just been conditioned to normalize systems that exploit people. And he really shows an understanding. And this is when he's at his best, because I agree with you, Roxana. There's so much that Pope Francis does and says that I'm just like, oh no, why did you say that? You know, and there's still a lot of things that, like, he is a man in his 80s from a very specific part of the world. But I think when it comes to his understanding of how we have been conditioned to just accept the fact that there are people who are just going to have a whole lot of money and a lot of people who are just going to have no money. I think his understanding of that is where he is sort of shines the brightest for me, because he really, you know, the reason why my book and the journey that I kind of describe in this book is so accessible is because I came of age under Pope Francis's papacy, and I came of age at a time where he's really encouraged people to internalize that accessibility and to think about really profound and abstract things that are still, a lot of the stuff he says in Fratelli Tutti still feels very profound and abstract, but there is also there's a very clear and specific understanding of, hey, we're not going to survive if we keep taking and taking and taking. We're not going to survive if we keep destroying the planet. We're not going to survive if we keep viewing each other as enemies, if we keep being polarized. We're not going to survive by ourselves, right? It's going to require a collective effort, because I'm not going to dismantle systems of oppression by myself. You're not going to do it by yourself. Pax Christi is not going to do it by itself, right? It's going to require a huge radical change, because it's going to require us to unlearn things that we have been learning since we could read and write, right? We're talking about very neoliberal institutions that push these ideas that maintain power, that maintain empire. And that is the understanding that he shows, right? He's like, hey, you guys have to unlearn and deconstruct literally every single lens that you have developed. And that's really, really scary. And it's not easy, because after you deconstruct it, there are not going to be any easy answers, because once you deconstruct, now we all have to figure out how to survive, right? And I think that he has challenged me and has helped me to think about what it means to do this work, and to do it, like, yes, in very, very practical ways, but to also understand, hey, there's a lot of sort of ideological shift that we have to do too, because we have been conditioned to be consumerist, right? I know how easy it is for me to open my phone and to order something and to buy something and to do anything that's going to require someone else to do it for me. And it's not easy to unlearn that, but he is giving us, like I said during my talk, there's a blueprint there, right? He's saying, hey, reject consumerism, build community, build brotherhood, build fraternity, be like the Good Samaritan, go to the person who is suffering in front of you and figure out how to help them. There are very real practical ways to begin to unlearn that very colonialist way of thinking that I know I have internalized and I wasn't even born in this country. I wasn't even born in a Western country like the United States. And that is still very much a part of my identity. But he's asking us to say, hey, if you really believe that Jesus was an oppressed person who died for our sins and who was killed by the state, then you have to also challenge the state, because the state is still killing people. The state is still incarcerating people, and the state is still profiting off of people. So yeah, I could ramble on for hours about this document alone, but I really think that he possesses a framework that can be so crucial for the type of revolutionary work that we're trying to do together.
And can I also say that he is actually from our neck of the woods, from Latin America.
Yes.
So still a man and is still white in Latin America.
Right.
However, born and raised in Argentina, and of course, part of the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, and a society who has been highly influenced by the Guaraníes in Uruguay. So there's, a cosmovision that is really, partially at least rooted in South American understanding of the world. And so I think there's a lot to talk about there, but I also wanted to, because I just found a TED talk where he says, if I may read it for you, he says, the current economic system is unsustainable. We are faced with the moral imperative and the practical urgency to rethink many things, the way we produce, the way we consume, our culture of waste, our short-term vision, the exploitation of the poor and our indifference towards them, the growing inequalities and our dependence on harmful energy sources. We need to think about all these challenges. And he also mentions, it also implies a renewed politics conceived as one of the highest forms of charity. Yes, love is interpersonal, but love is also political. It involves all peoples and it involves nature. I just love this quote, and so I had to bring it to the space because it's talking about all the things that you are talking about, right? This connection that we need to keep with our Mother Earth, creation, and that is something that is left out of the spaces when we talk about, even from the left, honestly. Right and left, because these are like Western ideologies also. And so I really like the idea of having a pope that, and I hope at least partially rooted in the cosmovision of the indigenous people of this side of the world, and is really bringing it to this space where he can impact millions of people and hopefully the economic model as well. Well, I have to jump to the next question. The time is always so limited, but there's one that says, in the book, you call for police abolition. And you speak to police abolition versus police reform or defunding.
Yes, thank you for that question. It's definitely one that I think I get often. So when I call for the abolition of law enforcement, the reason I wanted to include that, and the reason why I think as Catholics we should really internalize that, is because if we're talking about colonialism and we're talking about how this country was literally born from the pillaging of indigenous lands and from the murder of indigenous peoples, everything that was born from that is a system of violence. Everything that was born from that colonialism, that European colonialism on these lands, everything that came from that is inherently violent because it was built off of the exploitation and murder of indigenous brown bodies, and then through the slave labor of Africans brought to this country. And it was enslaved persons that built every single system in this country. And then once these enslaved persons got their freedom, we created systems to further incarcerate these newly freed people. So law enforcement, police departments are not these departments that were born out of this very gracious attempt to create a better world. No, these were systems that were created to capture and incarcerate enslaved persons in the South, or to repress labor struggles in the North, right? These are systems that were literally set up to incarcerate and censor people who were fighting for liberation. And that has stayed true since these systems were put in place in our country. And they have only gotten worse with the turn of the 20th century, when we had new people introduce different tactics of policing, and tactics of policing that included stereotyping marginalized groups, right? This has only gotten worse throughout the years with the prison industrial complex, right? Because now that is another labor force that we need, right? We have to use cheap prison labor. And so law enforcement has to make sure that we have people keeping those prisons full. And we have the introduction in recent years of artificial intelligence, right? So we have new forms of incarcerating and policing people. And these systems have involved, these law enforcement systems have only evolved to continue to exploit marginalized communities, because these systems are not concerned with keeping our streets safe. These systems are concerned with keeping the people who have power and the systems that have power in this country with power. And it's very, very difficult for people to understand that, because they think, well, you know, why can't we just defund the police? Why can't we just do it incrementally? Well, we can't fix something that was broken from the time it was created. We cannot reform a system that was literally created to incarcerate marginalized groups so that they wouldn't have their freedoms and God-given liberties that we believe, or we pretend to believe, in this country. And so that's the difference for me, right? Police abolition is an understanding that systems that have internalized colonialist violence, white supremacist violence, and oppress any groups cannot be reformed. These are systems that were made to exploit our communities, and they're only going to continue to do what they have always set up to do. And these are systems, for example, the NYPD gets millions and millions and millions of dollars at a time when, in a pandemic, our educators are struggling to have the tools and resources that they need to teach in person, right? So if people are truly concerned with defunding the police or working incrementally, then it means, okay, let's take this budget and allocate it to the spaces that we need to. But ultimately, abolition for me, and I think for Catholics in general, means, or why I believe Catholics should internalize abolition and fight for more abolition rhetoric instead of defunding rhetoric, is because, again, Jesus was killed by the state, right? Jesus was killed by what could be considered the law enforcement of his day. And these are systems that are still doing the same thing today, right? These are systems that are exploiting and killing and incarcerating people. And if we want to build a community where everyone is free, then we cannot have a community where people are incarcerated. We cannot have a community where people are removed from their families, from their loved ones, and not given the opportunity to thrive, the opportunity to succeed in our lives and to participate, right? And I think this is why I was so key on including that abolitionist lens in my work.
You know, this really reminds me of the struggle, for migrant justice, of people always bringing narratives that talk about a broken system. Mm-hmm. And I always try to remind them and always remind myself that the system is not broken, right? The system was created specifically to push people out. Mm-hmm. Because of, the same scenario, right? Like labor force and whatnot. So I believe it also wants to hide the root causes of, in that case, migration, right? Why are people being pushed out of their communities, right? What is influencing the spaces where they are to a level of that they have to leave, that they have to flee. And you as well as myself, right? Also families who had to make that decision of leaving, of fleeing. A lot of times we say, oh, economic reasons, but economic reasons have an origin also. Like what happened?
Right.
You know, it was a trade agreement, a free trade agreement, you know, like all these things impact our communities in different ways. And at the end, push us out of our communities. Of course, needless to say, the School of the Americas that keeps training Army personnel that is being tied to mini coups around around Latin America, and actually they also do other trainings in other parts of the world. And so, you know, thinking about that, and it really resonates with that struggle as well, and it does, because it's connected, right? It's connected, and I really think we need to mention and really bring back what you mentioned in your talk, Palestine. Palestine. Let's talk about Palestine.
Right. Yeah, because honestly, that is one of the things that in recent years too, or like even in this year alone, right? I talked about being really new to Palestinian history and the Palestinian struggle for liberation, and learning that NYPD officers, US law enforcement, also train with Israeli soldiers, and to know that American weapons are used to exploit and kill the Palestinian people, and to know that the very same system that we are working to abolish in this country is, like you're saying, Roxana, is also doing the exact same thing that we see here, right? The same type of police brutality that we are seeing all across the United States. That is also the same type of brutality, the same type of militarized violence we're also seeing in occupied territories, right? It's the same type of violence I've seen in the Dominican Republic, right? When we talk about abolishing law enforcement here, is because we understand that it is part of this larger military industrial complex that has very, very real ramifications all around the world, and especially with Palestine, right? I think when we talk about unlearning and deconstructing the revisionist history that this country teaches us, it doesn't teach us that Palestinians had an entire history before Israel was created, right? They don't teach us that there were these people and traditions that were ingrained there for generations. And instead, all we hear is, well, you know, they don't care about peace, or they're so adamant against it's a anti-Semitic movement, right? And these are not things we're not taught. We're not given the actual historical lens to learn about these things and to think about these things, because that is another way that the empire is maintained, right? You have to not teach people what's actually happening, because that is why so many people like myself, I'm 31 years old, and it has taken me now and writing a book to start centering the Palestinian cause, right? And I'm still learning so much of it, because again, the very neoliberal white spaces, Catholic spaces that I have been a part of have not taught me to think about that. And even as I was preparing for this talk, right, before you sent me the statement of principles, I thought to myself, can I even talk about Palestine, right? Because we know how it is to even talk about that. And once I saw the statement of principle, I was like, oh, no. They stand with this struggle, and we have to talk about this. Even if it's something that I'm engaging with for the first time, we have to talk about that struggle, and we have to say, hey, we understand why this oppression happens, right? It's not just Israel that's involved in this. It's also a US-backed violence that it's happening there, right? It's the same weapons that we see here. It's the same type of police tactics that we saw last year in New York City during all of these anti-racism protests. And I think that in particular is the Palestinian cause is such an important one for Catholics to get involved in, because like you mentioned earlier, Roxana, nobody is free until we are all free. And in order for us to get to that freedom, we need to understand what the roadblocks are to that freedom, especially right now with our Palestinian brothers and sisters.
And we have to mention that you know, that is the land of Jesus, right? Who was born under an occupation as well. And so if we truly want to follow the steps of Jesus, of that Jesus who was born from what would be considered now a working class family, who was born under an occupation, who was persecuted, who was a refugee, who was ultimately murdered by the empire, right? And then seeing the the trajectory of where the gospel was taken, right?
Mhm.
It was taken to Europe, and it was used, it was as a tool to colonize others, to colonize people like Jesus,
Mhm.
actually,
Mhm.
right? And that's what we're seeing here in the world. And so how do we, I like to use the word reclaim
Mhm.
that Jesus, reclaim the Jesus that was organizing with others, that reclaim that Jesus who was like, you know what, I'm going to do it anyway. And it cost his life and whatnot. But I think if we don't look at the gospel and really get grounded on that, we miss the point. What is to be a Catholic?
Right. And I also love how those very real connections that you made, right? This is the land of Jesus. This is where Jesus lived out his ministry, where the gospel was really born. And to know that, internalize that, but also understand that this was taken to Europe and it became something that white people weaponized. And the Christianity, the way that people in the Dominican Republic were introduced to Christianity was through colonialist violence. And what does it mean for Catholics to say, like, hey, Christianity is itself a tool that has been used by white supremacists, but it's also this very real thing born out of this brown man in the Middle East who said, you know what, I'm going to die for what I believe in. I'm going to die for my people. And it's so important to do exactly what you just said, Roxana, because this is what it means when I think about deconstructing my Christianity and finding a way to really feel as if I am living out my faith. It means doing exactly what you just said. It means reclaiming that gospel from Jesus, right? To feel that energy where it's like, wait a minute, you're supposed to fight and you're supposed to literally put your life on the line for people who have less than, for the person who is the most oppressed. And that in and of itself, nothing really sort of sustains my faith life like that right there, right? This idea of reclaiming our faith from the very colonialist violence that introduced our faith to us in the first place, because that is the gospel right there. You're absolutely right that there's power there.
And the fact that if we don't get grounded on that understanding, we are not able really to challenge a lot of the hate that is coming out with reason, I should add. And I think we have to mention the mass murder that was committed against Indigenous children throughout Turtle Island. Now, of course, there are many graves that are being found in Canada and I believe already in the US, and that's going to continue, right? And how are we grappling with that? How are we taking action on pushing our leadership to really open up the files in the archives, right? And really take responsibility on what has happened. And then move from there. Let's move from there and really hold on to the gospel, right? Really reclaim the gospel. And I have to say that this is not new, right? People throughout Latin America, throughout different parts of Africa and Asia have been reclaiming the gospel and really taking action for liberation, for collective liberation. So we have to recognize that as well. We still have a whole lot of questions from the chat that my colleagues are sharing with me because I'm not able to keep track of this chat. You're just like, you have so many questions, Olga. But let me try to take one here. It says, my personal observation is that the privileged expect to feel good about their social justice actions. It is as if they must be recognized and rewarded. Would you comment on this? Rosa Manriquez, thank you for your question.
Yes, I can. Thank you for that question. And I can totally comment on that. I think that, again, that's a very real thing that we feel in our consumerist culture, right? We have been conditioned to think about, well, I'm going to do this if it benefits me. I'm going to do this if it makes me feel good. I'm going to do this if it can do anything better, beneficial for me, right? But here I'm going to use the words of one of my activist friends who I've learned, who I met throughout the pandemic, who says, doing liberatory work is not about people knowing your name. It's not about you building fame. It's not about you gaining popularity. It's about you doing the work that you're doing. And I think this is just a reminder, especially for white Catholics who are doing this work. It is not about you feeling good. It is not about us patting you on the back because you're doing the bare minimum, right? Because again, we're talking about survival. We're talking about dismantling oppression, and we're talking about systems that are killing, even as we speak, that are killing Black and Brown, Indigenous, Asian, all marginalized groups. These are systems that are killing us, and nothing matters more than creating a world where that doesn't happen. And for 400 years in this country, whiteness has been the norm. Whiteness has been the status quo. And because of that, it's going to feel very jarring for someone to tell you, hey, your feelings don't matter. What you think doesn't matter. And it's not because we are trying to disregard who you are as a person. No, because everyone matters, right? Every single person is important. However, when we're talking about this work, when we're talking about decentering whiteness, then it means taking a back seat, and it means never getting acknowledgement for what you're doing, because that's not what this work is about. This work is about acknowledging the people who were killed on these lands. It's about acknowledging the people who built this country. It's about acknowledging the people whose names we are never going to know because they were murdered before we could even register who these people were. And I think that that is what I often try to tell people who are in situations where white Catholics want to feel good. It's not about you feeling good, because we're talking about survival. We're talking about life or death. And that matters more than whether or not someone views you as an ally, right? Because Jesus didn't do these things so that he could be accepted, right? He wasn't accepted for these things. It's not about acceptance. It's not about popularity. It's about, if you care about the gospel and you care about what it means to be Catholic, then you care about building a world where people are free. And for a lot of white people and people with privilege, that's going to mean you not mattering in a lot of regards, right? Because so many groups have not mattered for such a long time, and they are the priority, right?
Yeah, and I think this is particularly hard in our Catholic culture because whiteness has been centered for so long, as you just mentioned, and moving away from that is hard, right? Because the idea of like going on mission trips to teach others about, you know, the world and like things that, to civilize them is very ingrained in a lot of folks. And so it will take a whole lot of work to start moving away from that and really centering the not only the full humanity of folks, but also their cosmovision, right, of the world. And that's I think very challenging. We obviously ran out of time, but we are so thankful to you, Olga. We are just so thankful for your presence here, for your words, for your energy, for your vulnerability, for all what you bring into the spaces. We look forward to continue working with you. I really hope. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just want to say thank you to everyone again who tuned in. And Roxana, thank you so much. I always love being invited to talk in these spaces, but I always especially love it when I'm joined in conversation with another woman of color, because then it feels like a space, again, where we're just like, can you believe how awful white supremacy is? And can you believe that we're talking about white supremacy again? So thank you. It was wonderful.
People get to hear us, so that's
right,
very valuable. You should know that.
Right. So thank you again.
Thank you, and thank you everybody for listening.
And thank you very much. Thank you, Olga, for an incredible start to our conference. We're so very honored to have you here. I think you've given us a lot to talk about. And Olga, you got a whole lot of questions here that we unfortunately were unable to get to tonight. So I certainly hope there'll be another opportunity to have this conversation. Both of you all, I think a lot of people are sharing that they could listen to both of you smart, intelligent women all night long, you and Roxana both. So they're absolutely right. So thank you very much for being here, and thank you for participating. You know, over 400 folks in our Pax Christi USA community participated in our most recent Literary Circle for Liberation, which focused on your book. And it is a great honor to have you here with us tonight and to build on what you offer by way of critique and guidance in your book as our community joins in the refrain that Black Lives Matter. And so once again, thanks to both of you, Olga and Roxana, for a lively and challenging conversation. In just a few moments, we're going to bring tonight's plenary conference plenary to a close with our closing prayer. But before that, I do want to make a few announcements for this evening. So many of you have given generously to help us grow and expand this movement. And we hope if you like what you've been seeing and taking part of as members of this community, you'll consider making an extra donation to support this ordinary organization. I'm going to ask Johnny or Lauren to post a link in the chat box right now to our donation page on the website where you can go and make a quick, secure donation right now. Or if you wish to send in a donation, maybe we can also post the address of the national office for people to send their checks. Again, I want to thank you in advance for giving whatever you can to keep building on what we're already doing together. Every little bit helps. Also, this conference could not have happened without the generosity of our co-sponsors who have made special donations to help us cover the cost and make this a free event for all to attend. So these sponsors are Jeannie Allen, Rosemary Pace, Abigail Abyssala Metzger, please forgive me if I messed up your name, Father Fred Thalen, Marie Dennis, Ronnie Fellerath Lowell and Bill Lowell, hi guys, Bishop John Stowe, our Bishop President, Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet, Los Angeles Province, Sisters of Mercy of the America's Justice Team, Pax Christi Little Rock, the Association of U.S. Catholic Priests, Sisters of Divine Providence, Carol Rice, the International Thomas Merton Society, Maryknoll Lay Ministers, Mary Yelnick, Holy Spirit Missionary Sisters, Vicky Lott, Pax Christi, Michigan, Father Joe Mattern and Pax Christi Amro Oshkosh, the Palestinian Christian Alliance for Peace, Father Gerald Kleba, Sisters of Charity of Leavenworth, JPIC office, and Beatrice Parwatikar. A deep bow of gratitude to you all. Okay, so for tomorrow's gathering, you will use the same link you used tonight to get in here, so keep that link handy. Now, we'll have more moving parts tomorrow, including navigating breakout sessions that technologically are going to require a higher degree of difficulty, so we're going to do the best that we can to get everyone where they're supposed to be, which means I will have no part in the technology. Know that some sessions were full and you may not find yourself in the breakout session you originally signed up for. If that is the case, we'll place you in one of the alternate sessions. Next, I want to recognize my colleagues in leadership from the National Council that are with us tonight. We have Vice Chair Madeline Labriola of Rhode Island, Madam Secretary Charlene Howard of Washington, D.C., Treasurer Brian Ashmankas of Massachusetts, Manuel Padilla of Oregon, Sherry Simon of Arkansas, Linda Howell Perrin of Kentucky, Vicky Lott of Texas, Sister Diane Smith of California, Father Fred Thalen of Michigan, Peter Majura of Virginia, and our esteemed Bishop President, Bishop John Stowe of Lexington, Kentucky. And our newly elected members joining us in October include Yvonne Gillen of Washington State, Jeff Saved of Washington, D.C., and Josephine Garnham of Maryland. And as always, I want to recognize and thank our Bishop President Emeritus, Bishop Thomas Gumbleton. As far as special guests, we have Pax Christi USA Teachers of Peace among us this weekend, including Bishop Thomas Gumbleton, Art Laffin, Kathy Kelly, Kathy McGinnis, MJ and Jerry Park, Father Peter Doherty, and of course, this year's awardee, Father Brian Massengill. And we'll spotlight some other special guests tomorrow. And lastly, thanks to all of you for joining us tonight and for being the peace of Christ in the world today. It is an honor, and I mean a deep and sincere honor, to serve as your National Council Chair. So let's end with tonight's closing prayer. And I think I'm going to bring it over to you, Brother Padilla.
Thank you, Brother Chandler. I want to ask folks, wherever you are, and if you're able, to lift up your arms and to reach out to your left and to your right, so that in each little box of this Zoom call, it looks like we're reaching out to the people on either side of us, holding hands across the distance, visibly demonstrating that we are indeed one body. That's really beautiful, actually. We know that we are surrounded by a cloud of witnesses, and that over the past year or so, we've lost some of those who shone brightest among us. We remember in a special way tonight, Pax Christi USA, Teacher of Peace, and Deputy Director Sister Diana Ortiz, who passed earlier this year in February. While we no longer have her physical presence with us, we know she is with us even more deeply now, gathering us in, holding us close, and helping us to be the peace of Christ, the community of Pax Christi. I'd like to ask folks now to type into the chat the names of other Pax Christi members that have transitioned to that cloud of witnesses this past year, and we'll read out those names and number them among us tonight. So I'll give you all a moment to do that. And Johnny will read those names. And then I'll read an excerpt, a prayer.
Sue Malone, Nikki Valdez, Father John Roush, Father Bob Jones, Leona Williams, Nancy McDonald, Tom Webb, Sister Betty Donahue, Mary Ann Garrigan, John X. Linehan, Sister Ardith Platt, Cardinal Laurent Monsenguo, Joe Hamilton, Dr. Mercedes Iannone, Father Peter Hind, Marge Bryan, Father Joe Keenan, Helen Casey, Brother Lou Schwartz, Christopher Posh, Rachel and Mary, Guillermo Martinez, Father Rich Creason, Jerry and Sandy Putman, Clarence and Amelie, DJ Schwartz, Kay Lent, Mac Hall, Hipólito Bendezú. Presente.
Thank you, Johnny. Thank you, everyone, for putting in names. We really appreciate being able to add to the cloud of witnesses that we know are with us today. And in light of the challenges and encouragement that Olga shared with us today, let us pray. God of heaven and earth, you created the one human family and endowed each person with great dignity. Aid us, we pray, in overcoming the sin of racism. Grant us your grace in eliminating this blight from our hearts and our communities, our social and civil institutions. Fill our hearts with love for you and our neighbor, so that we may work with you in healing our land from racial injustice. Through Christ we pray. Amen.
So thank you, everyone. Just a quick reminder too, that for tomorrow, that in your schedule, all times are Eastern time zone. So please make sure you do the math accordingly, depending on what time zone you are in. In just a second, we're going to unmute everybody now in case folks want to stick around a few minutes and say hi to people that they recognize. There's a lot of folks on here, so I'm sure that we will certainly do as the good book says and go out and make a joyful noise. So I'll see everyone tomorrow a little before noon Eastern Daylight Time, and peace to you all.
And everybody can unmute themselves if they'd like to say hello to folks or recognize people they see or give a little peace sign.
Thank you, Isaac. Love you.
Love you guys too. Thank you so much. Hey, Janice.
Hey, how you doing? Great job.
Do what I can.
Yeah.
Oh, you did wonderful. Appreciate you.
Albano.